Okay. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Francesca Dubrock, and I serve as the Chief Curator here at the Anchorage Museum. I'm going to start us off this afternoon with a little land acknowledgement. So I'd like to invite you all to close your eyes, plant your feet firmly on the floor, and imagine down beneath the carpet or the concrete to the ground beneath you. And just take a moment to give thanks for the land that's holding you up. In Anchorage, this is the land of the Eklutna Dena'ina. I would like to offer gratitude for centuries of Dena'ina care and for their ongoing leadership and stewardship of these beautiful lands and waters. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our artist this afternoon, David Brame, also known as the amazing David Brame. David Brame is an artist and comic illustrator originally from South Carolina, currently based in Homer, Alaska. Brame holds a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Cincinnati, where he was a Yates Fellow. He has taught art at the university level in both Canada and the United States and developed comic-based curricula for school-age children. Creating work rooted in Afro-futurist traditions, Brame often collaborates with other Black writers and creatives to envision worlds that make space for a multiplicity of Black futures. Recent projects include a 36-page comic inspired by the first Black superhero titled Lion Man 1, as well as After the Rain, an adaptation of Nnedi Okorafor's On the Road. Brame's work has been shown at museums and galleries across the US, including the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, as part of Before Yesterday We Could Fly, an Afro-futurist period room. He is the recipient of an Eisner Award for his work on After the Rain. So today, David is going to be sharing about his practice and demonstrating some cartooning and character development techniques. We organize these sessions to be informal and accessible and a place for people to ask questions and get to know the artist and learn more about their process. So I really encourage folks to drop questions and comments in the chat, and I will relay those to David while he's working. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. That was super awesome. I kind of always forget the stuff I've done until somebody lets me know. So yeah, for today, I'm just gonna I guess get into it with that introduction. Typically with when you're doing comic work and coming up with ideas, something that I do quite often, you kind of run into this process of always having to come up with something new, something interesting, something dynamic. So we'll talk about a few of my techniques and a few of the things that I get into when I'm drawing. But specifically for today, we're going to work on doing some of the more genre-based stuff. And by that, I mean horror, sci-fi, science fiction, fantasy, those kinds of options. So I'm gonna share my screen real quick. Excellent. Here we go. Cool. So, as you can see, I have a little art piece presented, and like I was saying, a lot of the things that I work on, or I've been working on recently, are genre based. So, I've mostly been doing, like I said, science fiction and fantasy, and the like. So, what you can see here are some. I'll show you sort of first some examples of these kind of more esoteric images, and then I'll sort of do a quick demonstration of how I kind of come up with some of these ideas. What you see here is one of the pieces from the book After the Rain, before it was colored. So these are some of the pieces. This is in the book After the Rain, Nettie described this asphalt monster, like this monster made completely out of, you know, pieces of street. And so it was like this sort of like this giant monster made of road pieces that also had like an African mask as like the main portion of it. So you can see here, we sort of developed like sort of this kaiju style monster with an African mask. Here, there's like this sort of weird, this is from one of my series called Dusty Funk. It's a sort of conceptual art, Afro-surrealist book. Here, like, I've sort of taken some of these, some cues from other parts of life, you know, like you can see this sort of like giant monster with this like glowing tummy, you know, in this one. With this one, it's sort of like a giant character. The back is kind of like this open, I guess you could say, like orifice with like all of these squiggly tentacles and these kinds of things like coming out of its back. Here we have like I was just sort of thinking, like, you know, how do you make a baby very creepy? I mean, I guess maybe for some people, some babies are like infants are always a little creepy when they like first come out. Like, how do you make it even creepier? Like in this instance, I have sort of added some weird sort of like crab-like antenna, and you know, here this was like a job where the prompts were coming up with sort of new kaiju. And if you're not sort of like familiar with the idea of what a kaiju is, that's a kaiju or like Godzilla, or if you've ever seen like the movie Pacific Rim, that's what kind of what these animals were based off of. And in like sort of in the 1970s and 80s, they always had these little trades, these books that were mostly built around, you know, how are these things, how do they function? So we kind of did like fake organs and, you know, tried to come up with interesting ways to describe or to come up with these new giant monsters. And with this one is like based on like a woolly mammoth, and the other one is based on these I think they're called like vampire snails. They're these snails that like that cover themselves with these like little pieces of iron so that they can survive near volcanoes. So I always thought that was pretty cool.
David, can I interject here and ask a quick question?
Yes.
So when you're talking about creating these characters and, you know, you're drawing on aspects from your imagination or from sort of popular lore, but then you're also like using ideas from reality in the natural world. Like, how do you marry those two ideas? How do you, like, do you research to find an organism like the snail that, you know, might be a good fit? Or is it just like, you know, you're reading a National Geographic and thinking about a monster and some synergy happens? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what happened. So, I mean, I have like a kind of a wealth of knowledge. I mean, I'm sort of a trivia nerd, and you know, I've watched a lot of David Attenborough, and you know, I had all the highlights, you know, comics, or not comics, but magazines when I was a kid or whatever. I guess for those of us who are old enough to know when that existed, you know, and the zoo books and all that kind of stuff. So I sort of pull from those sort of that base knowledge that I have, and in the design process, I usually you know, I present some ideas to clients, or if I don't have a client, you know, this is something I'm working on solo, you know, I just kind of think of what would be weird or esoteric or different than what we've already seen. Because typically a lot of people choose like lizards or turtles, or you know, something that's reptilian. You know, they kind of like choose what's already there. Like what we're seeing on the screen right now is like it's like a capuchin like monkey. So that's what I pulled from. But instead of you know, I think I started with like the biome first. So I was thinking like what exists in the cloud forest. And then from the cloud forest, I sort of built from that, like, oh, there's lots of monkeys, and like capuchin monkeys are pretty popular. People understand them. They get them visually. And then I think of, how do I make this different? Like, how do I make it more than just, let's say, Godzilla or King Kong or some of these other more popular like versions of a giant monkey or a giant lizard. And then from there, as you'll see on some of these other images as I move forward, I just start adding stuff to them. You know, like I'll add extra eyes, I might add horns, or you know, extra arms, or you know, maybe I'll make it a little more grotesque, or I'll make it a little more smooth. And I guess it doesn't always have to be giant things. Like, you know, it just so happens that I've had a lot of clients that have wanted me to do kaiju. So like on this next one, doing something that's more horrific. Like this is just like a specter, I guess, in a way. So this is like a character that's just you know, it was based off of sort of like the sleep paralysis demons. But from this one, I started actually from another creator that I love, whose name is Junji Ito. He's a Korean manga artist, and my first thought was like, I want to make a sort of like a sleep paralysis demon, but do it in the style of Junji, and then like incorporate that into my own style. So with this one, you know, I just was like, how creepy can I, like, he really involves himself in that type of horror where it's like about like how, just like, how can you make this person's skin crawl? Not so much like, because when you're doing like still images, when you're doing like comics, it's harder. It's much harder to make people afraid, because you don't have like the tricks you get when you do like moving media, like animation or movies, you know. So you have to rely on other things that make people unsettled. So with this one, you add extra eyes or lots of pustules and weird cracked skin. You add extra tongues, or you know, a gaping mouth or weird teeth. These kinds of things are already, I think, creepy for a lot of people. You know, like people who, you know, you just see somebody who looks weird, whatever that weird thing is for you. There's lots of different faces out there. And then you just like, you add more to it. But when you're creating, it always doesn't have to be within horror. It can always be also be in the realm of like fantasy. So that includes things like anthropomorphism. So you take like a human body, but then you add, you connect it to other items. So like this is a leopard. It's a leopard man, you know, and he's a villain. So you know, you make him a little more angry looking. This one is Rawhead and Bloody Bones. This one actually pulls from folklore. This is like South Carolina folklore, and he's this Geechee Gullah character named Rawhead, and he essentially he steals children, and eats them, or eats their life force in a way. But he's like he presents himself as this sort of like he's a skinned character. He has like you can see all of his organs, and he was sort of like you don't see like all of his pieces, I guess. And he's like I guess Bloody Bones is the body, and Raw Head is the floating head. And so with this one, it was not so much that I was pulling from things that already exist in terms of like visually. This is more of a story, and it's folklore. So I was taking from their descriptions of how he was written, and then making my own version of what that looks like.
When you're doing these characters, are you also thinking about, like, in addition to their physical attributes, like their personalities and how they're going to behave within the story?
Oh, absolutely. Like especially when I'm dealing with something like the one we were just looking at previously, like Rawhead and Bloody Bones. He has uh Geechee and Gullah culture in South Carolina, and I think it exists in some parts of Georgia as well, like close to like Savannah and coastal regions. Um, there's both like a particular way they speak. There's a particular way that they have a storytelling tradition. So it's all based on almost these sort of like folkloric gospels, and so there's a lot of rhyming, and there's a lot of these kinds of ways of like describing the character. And I wanted to come from that space and like add my own little bits into to what that comes from, or where that came from. Here's some kaiju, your standard one, like based off of like a lizard. Here is this is like a space creature. So we were trying to deal with like how to make something like so big that it doesn't seem like you don't have like a reference for what that could be. What does something in space look like? It's kind of very hard thing to come up with, because we can typically only pull from stuff we already know, right? Or things we've only seen. It's like hard to come up with like, what is a creature that is entirely based out of silicone? What does that look like? Or a creature that like its main basis for its life force is like boron, or some element we've never discovered. Like how does that work? And that's kind of the puzzle that designers like come up with. And usually it's just pulling from things we've already seen, or things that are already weird, and that already exist in the space that we already have. Like the ocean itself. Like I said, I watched a lot of David Attenborough as much as I can, a lot of nature documentaries, but there's so many weird things in the ocean, and we've explored very little of it. And every time they come up with something new from like the deep ocean, it's always the weirdest looking thing. And there's always this I don't know, I think it's a meme at this point, but it's this idea that like crabs have gone through like multiple extinction events, and they always, like when they start again, like from like protozoa moving forward, there's always another crab that gets created. So a general idea is to think of like crustaceans as space creatures, or it's a good place like to start for designing. Then there's also like other weird things like this, where you're mixing multiple pieces. This is sort of like a steampunk, weird snail, like that has like a giant baby that's driving you know, it's like it's all about like finding these weird little pieces, and then like I said, like just adding more to it and just keep adding and adding and adding and adding, and that's sort of the general space that I start in for designing, and I kind of want to show everyone else, like, you know, where I come from, and that place. So I'm going to, I guess, sort of show you how I start my design process. Typically, you know, I work digitally, and you know, I also do like traditional work, but that usually has its own different place for how I design and how I create. But in the space, I usually work digitally, and there's like two ways to sort of design. You know, I mean, and there's probably many ways to design, but at least for me, um, there's two ways that I work. One is the first one I'll show you is basically, you know, I start with uh, simple shapes, and then I build out from those simple shapes. So I can start with like any kind of like squiggle. You know, I'll just make some weird shapes, and from these like initial shapes, it's almost like stream of consciousness. Like from there, I can start adding bits, and like I said, you always want to be adding bits. So like I'm just like, I like this shape. So how do I make shape a little more interesting? Where do I want to go from there? You know, you start adding weird eyes, and from there, I can add like other little bits. So I can make this like goofier. I can make it more, um, I guess, bizarre. You know, like, but you just start picking things that, you know, from basic anatomy, I guess. If you have like a good understanding of anatomical structures and like animals and those kinds of things, you kind of always want to start there, and then you just keep adding more, you know. And I always think, like, in general, more is always better when it comes to fantasy, when it comes to horror, when it comes to you know, these sort of genre based creations. You just keep adding, and eventually you start getting sort of like this sort of flow. You start to understand where you're going with your image. You know, you're just like, okay, maybe this is a dude that's like entirely composed of a bunch of weird eyes. You know.
David, what program are you using to draw on?
I'm using a very archaic program. It's called Autodesk Sketchbook Pro. It's pretty cheap. I think it's free. You can get the free version. There's a $5 version, and there's like a $15 version that has like more like tools you can work with. But this program is fairly old. Like at this point, it's I think I started drawing with this program in like 2008 or something like that. But probably what is most people use at this point, in sort of popular culture for design and digital drawing. There's a program called Procreate, also very inexpensive. I think it's like $15 or cheaper. There's the Adobe makes a version called art art essentials or something like that. And there's also Clip Studio Pro, which is I think a pretty good one as well. So I'm using, like I said, I'm using Autodesk Sketchbook Pro. This is like the standard version, and but most people use Procreate. There's a lot of options. You can paint, you can do printmaking, like and you know, you can make things look as like grandiose and natural as possible. But I'm so like, I guess like used to this program. My workflow works in such a way that that I don't really want to like change it at the moment. Like it's like, you know, you don't want to go show up on Thanksgiving with like the new dish, you know. So I'm kind of like I'm always sort of stuck making Thanksgiving dinner. So I'm not trying to try anything new right now. But there's many options out there. But I always think in this context, you know, go with what you know and stick with it. Like, I mean, because it's all just, in a way, it's all just a tool, you know. Some people still use like traditional methods, and I really love when I get a chance to do traditional things. It's like the speed is not really there for me. Like it takes a long time. It takes a long time to do things traditionally, but when I get a chance and have the option, like if I'm doing like a gallery show or you know, I'm getting a specific request, you know, it's nice to do things traditionally. But you know, if it's not broken and you're getting really quality results, like you might as well stick with the programs or the tools that you're used to.
For folks who are kind of starting out or younger viewers, do you recommend that they experiment with both digital drawing and traditional drawing, or do you think everyone should start out with pencil, or do you have a thought on that?
I think you should start out drawing. I don't know if it matters whether or not it's digital or if it's traditional. But I do think like in terms of like ideation, in terms of like building up your ideas, drawing is one of the quickest ways to sort of like tell a story very, very quickly and to get your ideas across. Yeah, I've heard these stories from some of my old like buddies or professors or whatever, where, you know, they were in, you know, they had to like communicate across different language barriers, like in different countries, you know, and all they had available to them was just like drawings to like, this was before Google Translate and all that kind of stuff. So you couldn't just like type it in and like you had your answers. You had to figure out like, how do I do this very difficult like print process between, you know, these multiple languages. So so like being able to draw and having that as like a skill is kind of all that that matters to me, I think, in a way. So whether or not you pick a program that you like, whether you draw with a pencil or a pen or you know, a digital tool or whatever it is, I think that's like that's up to you. I don't think one is better than the other. When I was teaching, I always liked to get people to draw with ballpoint pens, you know, to start off with that. Specifically because you can't erase. And I think what it teaches you when you can't erase things, when you can't go in and just edit whatever you're doing, what you do or what you get is like sort of like this facility in a way with like an acceptance of whatever you're creating. Like you're not spending so much time trying to make something perfect. Instead, you're kind of just flowing with whatever is already there. And I think that's I think that's one of the most important aspects of developing as an artist, as a drawer, or a sketcher, or whatever you want to call yourself, cartoonist, is sort of that acceptance of sort of the streamlined quality of whatever you're making. I mean, because I think anybody can make anything perfect. If you have enough time, you can always do something very perfect. You can go back and adjust and recreate, and you can spend years, perfecting or honing an image. But as the memes say, ain't nobody got time for that. So I think getting more ideas out is to me a little bit more important than just making a singular perfect image. Like I had someone mention to me the thing that makes a lot of great artists great is the fact that they're prolific, not necessarily that they're really amazing at one particular thing. They just produce a lot of stuff. One of my favorite artists, Jean-Michel Basquiat, like he just created. Like, I mean, a lot of us, I mean, he had a lot of crap. I mean, it's great now, in retrospect, but as he was making, like not every piece that he made is the greatest thing you've ever seen, but what he did is he painted all the time. He was always making different images, different types of images, different ways of like trying to develop images, so he just created a lot. And that was more important than let's say a singular, solitary perfect image. It's more about being prolific than being like I don't know how you'd say perfect.
How
So
did, oh, sorry, go ahead. Say
no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you could talk a little bit for the listeners about how you got started on your journey as an artist and a comic artist, and like those early attempts before. I mean, it's amazing to watch you draw because it's like just like I didn't see the tongue coming on that one you just did. And I was like, whoa, you went for a big tongue. And it's really cool to watch. So I'm just imagining, it's also a little intimidating for people that are just starting out with this. Like, if you could share a little bit about how you started out and developed the formidable skill that you now have as a comic artist.
Oh yeah. So like I was always like a Saturday morning like TV watcher. I don't know if that's a thing anymore, but like, I would, get a big bowl of cereal and that have like, the lined and ruled paper, from like grade school or whatever, and I would just sit there and try to draw what I saw on the TV screen. I was lucky enough to have a few mentors as a kid. I guess we call them that. I had an uncle who actually I think he got me on into like drawing in the first place. Like I don't think I was really that connected to like to the arts, as like a young person. But he was really into like cartooning. He used to try to draw like Calvin and Hobbes, or he would try to draw like, you know, Charles Schultz stuff, like, you know, Snoopy and all that kind of stuff. So he would like, you know, sit there and basically copy what he saw on like in like the newspaper. And so he kind of got me into that. And then I had this I guess like another mentor when I was young. His name was Scotty, and he's the one that got me into drawing. He called them, you know, muscle men. Is what he called them back then. So, you know, I started with like, you know, newspaper comics and like, you know, comic strips, and then he was just like, yeah, but we can add some muscles to those dudes, and so he kind of got me into like, I guess you would say like standard like comics, like superheroes and that kind of stuff. And I'll sort of show you right now, like kind of like what he, you know, this is the stuff he would like. He taught me to start with a triangle, and then you add some lines, and this is like basically like my first drawings all started out like this when I was like 5 and 6. You know, this is like the kind of stuff that he was teaching me how to do. And you know, this is basically, I mean, this is 100%, I think, like the first drawing I ever did. Like a superhero or something like that. You know, it's like something very, very simple like this with you start with shapes and then you get better. But I think what helped me develop was honestly like working from reference, you know, in different ways. I don't think there's anything wrong with copying or tracing or any of that kind of stuff, especially when you're an early drawer or when you're an early creator, because what it teaches you is, in a way, the right way to do things, you know, as opposed to just like sort of winging it and always being frustrated about what your experience is going to be. Like you can start with something that already exists, and then you kind of do like a master's copy in a way. You know, that's what I mean, I learned how to do that when I was in school, you know, like, you know, you pay $80,000 to go to school and they tell you to repaint, you know, a painting from another person. And that's how you learn how to paint, you know, that's how you learn how to draw. So I would say like, start with reference, start with people that you start with like a creator or a style that you really enjoy. So start there, and then from there, you know, you start developing all of the skills that you need from the people that have already sort of figured out the hard parts, you know, and then from there, that's when you start doing your own thing, you know. That's when you can start becoming a stylist anyway, in a way. I think that's really what I think a lot of creators end up doing, is stylization of basic concepts and basic ideas, you know, like you understand, once you start understanding anatomy and you start understanding and you can get all these things. Like, I know it could be very difficult to start to understand anatomy, or to get the ability to understand like proportion and sort of the accuracy that you can find in some drawing. But it's all about sort of doing something consistently, like doing it a lot, you know, never giving up in a way. You know, that's how a lot of people get really good, because they do it a lot, you know. And you can start, like I said, with other people's creations, and then you can, you know, you don't want to stay there sticking with other people's creations. Eventually you do want to like develop your own style. You do want to develop um, your own way of doing uh, anything, you know, like whatever it is, you know, whether it's drawing, cooking, painting, you know, anything creative you want to do, you can start doing it yourself and developing your own methodology in a way. You know, if you're into embroidery, my daughter is like she's a stellar embroiderer, and she like, you know, she started with um just like following like the little prompts, like doing cross stitch and those kinds of things, where it's already drawn on the you know, like on the fabric, and all she had to do was like, it was more like color by numbers. And once she learned how to like do different types of um like threading, sewing, I'm not gonna use, I'm gonna use all the wrong words, but once she got to the point where she's like, oh, I understand how to do this, what she started to do then was like develop her own, you know. And to me, that's like that's where it gets interesting, is when you get past the point of just like um just copying, you know. That's like your that's the practice part. And then when you can start making things on your own, when you can come up with your own ideas, um that's when it can get like really interesting. um so yeah, so she got to the point where she went from, you know, sort of copying or using these color by number pieces, to where she developed her own like style, and her own pieces, you know, where she just had like the cross stitch fabric, and she bought her own threads and chose her own colors and created her own images, all completely, you know, from nothing, from her imagination. um and I guess that's something that's really important to think about too, is like developing your imagination. Like um it can, I think intimidating is a good word to use, like because a lot of people don't know what to come up with, you know. And um that itself can be daunting. It can be a daunting task to like, well, what do I do, what do I do, what's important, like what matters. And you know, that's in some ways it's a personal question, like what does matter to you, what's important to you. Is the line work, is it the shapes, is it like making something like, you know, as weird or creepy as possible, or is like, you know, as cute or whatever as possible, you know. And then you just keep moving on from there. So with these little characters, you know, I was pretty much just showing you that you can kind of start with a simple shape, and then you can come up, you can like come up with anything, you know, based off of those simple shapes. And you can use those simple shapes to then like you know, sort of help with your own design practice when you want to come up with like weird or interesting items. Um, I think you mentioned earlier, is like, or it was a question earlier about, you know, sometimes I do work from reference, or I use reference as a way um, to start some of these images. So let's see what happens when um, let's see. I was gonna choose like a weird bug or something like that, and they use that as reference. There was one that had like this weird nose that I saw. But yeah, there we go. Let's try this bad boy right here. So we'll use the acorn weevil. So if you're running out of ideas, if you're running out of like inspiration, if somebody gives you a a design problem that you just can't solve with your own wealth of knowledge, there's always the internet. There's a million images, a million photos to choose from. There's just like the collective knowledge of the universe is like at our fingertips now. So you can just type in almost any like string of words and you can probably find something that can be inspiring. So we've got this acorn weevil, which is kind of cool. It's got like a really interesting shape. These like weird blue antenna things. So I'm just gonna sort of start with this general shape of this little weevil dude right here. Actually, we'll put that on a different layer. Sorry. Cut, paste. All right.
David, we have a question in the chat I'm going to ask you while you're drawing.
Okay.
Someone wants to know what helps you when you're feeling low on creativity or imagination.
Oh, I never feel low creativity or imagination. I think I'm constantly busy, so I think there's just so many things to be inspired by, like on a daily basis, especially if you're in Alaska. I mean, just natural beauty in itself is to me is it's pretty inspiring. It's pretty cool. I usually just take a walk. I go to the beach or find some place in the woods that's secluded. Hopefully, just let my dogs like run around, so I don't have to really think about what they're doing, and I just let my imagination wander. I think we're gonna make this into a sweet hat. So like, I think the thing is to like remain a child as long as possible. And if you already are a kid, just you're already doing it. Like try to find inspiration from as many things as you possibly can. Sometimes being bored is the best place to develop ideas. Like constantly having I know I was just sort of talking about that, but like we do always have like the constant like stimulus from everything, like always. So sometimes like it takes some boredom. It takes some like the ability to sort of disconnect yourself from all of the options, so your mind just will pull itself towards something that that really matters, and that becomes your inspiration or your muse, you know, in a way. Um, some people think that creativity is not a thing that we have inherently. You know, it's a thing that we connect to. You know, like there's this sort of universal like creative pool, and we all have the little antenna, little like creative straws that we can like just like suck up some ideas from the ether. And being in tune with that, being able to connect with that is like I think is how I personally always stay um in that sort of constant creative mojo. I mean, there are times where I get tired, which I think is different than like lacking like a creative drive. Like, I mean, I'm constantly interested in everything. Like, I think there's a little bit of serendipity everywhere you go. Like I remember when I moved to Alaska, I used to just like wander the beach, and like everything was awesome to me. There's these like little spiky, I call them like little spiky boys, but I don't know. They have like these yellow flowers, and they have like these little sort of spiked cones, and they hang out near the beach, and they have like all these little sort of succulent flowers. And to me, like those kinds of things are what help like me always sort of stay engaged, because I'm just like, oh, I never thought there would be this kind of thing on the beach, and to me, that is where like the sort of the, I guess in a way, the serendipity of things, of life, of creativity comes from. Is finding these little bits that are unexpected, and then sort of adding that to your own like creative expression and creative drive. So yeah, I guess in a way it's like just like get really bored so that you can get really inspired. Um,
That's great advice. Love it. Also love the new term spiky boys for those. David, I am been so mesmerized watching you draw. I should let you know we are about 5 minutes to the hour.
Okay.
Just so we stay on track. But I wanted to just ask you, I know it's a big question with little time, but to talk a little bit about Afrofuturism and why that's an important influence for you. I know we've been talking more about like monsters and drawing right in this live stream, but I think, for folks who are getting interested in your work and look up the different things that you've done, they'll definitely see those influences in some of your projects. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, like Afrofuturism to me is like everything. I mean, I'm sort of it's a big catch-all phrase that's sort of been used to describe a lot of things. I mean, like it recently developed prominence with things like Black Panther or I guess like Black Adam now or something like that, and connections with those things. But it's actually a new, I guess, a newish term. I guess now it's like whatever, like 30 years old now. Like 1993 is when the term was like coined, like where it came from. But there's been like creators like Octavia Butler or W.E.B. Du Bois, or Henry Dumas. Like there's been a lot of creators throughout history who were we're essentially doing Afrofuturism. And the thing about what futurism tends to purport is that there's possibility. You know, there's a future for whatever is going on, and that there's like some kind of like positive and expressive movement that is coming from what's happening. This term also includes like sort of speculative fiction, and ideas, and speculative is kind of what it describes itself as, which is you're speculating about what the future can become. You know, you're speculating about what these possibilities, based on like what's already happened. You know, what can we glean from that, and how can we make that into the futures that we have coming up. So me as an Afrofuturist and an Afro-surrealist, you know, I'm constantly thinking about how do I make myself a part of like what's coming up. You know, how do I use what's happened historically? How do I use that and make something that will connect with everybody, and that will help people understand my experience and other people who are like me, what their experiences are right now. You know, that's like the main point, I think, of what I think a lot of us are always trying to do. We're all trying to let people know now how we feel by using what we think is going to happen in the future. You know, like you know, it's wild for some people to they don't have to necessarily think about it, because in popular media these aspects of futurism are already sort of embedded into their cultural identity and what they're doing. You know, like but for some people it's you know, it's weird to think about like there being like, oh, this is the first, you know, if you ever watch Star Trek, you know, like you know, Michael Burnham is the first Black female like starship captain, you know, and we're talking since the 1960s. We're looking at like, I'm not good at math, whatever that is, like 80 years or 70 years of like cinematic history. This is the first one happened just now. And so it's about for a futurist, it's making sure that in a way these things come true. You know, Stacey Abrams, who's like you know a politician in Georgia. You know, she was sort of cast also in Star Trek as like, you know, a Black female president. You know, president of Earth, I think. And like that's a future we can all get around. You know, like we can all get on those kinds of things. It's something we want to happen. You know, so. And I think just in time, my pen is dying. But that's a lot about what futurism is about, is helping to sort of pick and choose from the events that we want to happen, or that are already happening, and then using popular media to try to make them to happen, to try to envision those positive and exciting futures.
That's great, David. Thank you for sharing that. It's amazing to see how this little acorn weevil is now transformed into this amazing headdress.
Yeah. So yeah, there you go. That's basically like my design process. That's kind of where I start, and then how I end.
That's great. I feel like we need follow-up chapters for seeing how all the color overlay happens, but maybe we can talk about that down the line.
But yeah, we can do that. This is just the drawing process. But if you ever want to like learn about my full process, I'm sure you all will be able to have my socials and stuff available. But I'm more than happy to talk to people. You can hit me up in the DMs. I'll
Awesome.
I'll chat you through, or we could do another process based piece.
That's great. I've put for everyone listening, we don't have too many folks live today, but this will be on the Anchorage Museum's Facebook for the foreseeable future. So if you look in the chat, there is a link to the article on the Anchorage Museum blog about David and his work. And there is also a link to his Instagram. So if you want to get in touch, follow those links. David, thank you so much for sharing with us. I always find it really relaxing watching people create, but it was extra special with yours because it's so detailed and you work so quickly. It was pretty amazing. And thank you for sharing all your knowledge and insights and kind of also inspirations for people who are maybe starting on their journey as younger artists.
Thank you. I'm happy to be included and to share my process.